Welcome to the Property Couch, where each week you get to listen to two of Australia's leading experts. Bryce Holdaway, co-host of Location Australia on Foxtel's Lifestyle Channel, co-host of Escape from the City on the ABC, and partner of Empower Wealth Advisory. Ben Kingsley, chair of Property Investors Council of Australia and the founder of Empower Wealth Advisory, named the 2018 and 2019 Property Advisory Firm of the Year. Stay tuned as they bring you the insider's guide to property, finance and money management.
All right, folks, welcome to the Property Couch podcast. And Benjamin, hello, welcome to you as well.
Well, mate, thanks for having me. I'm just so excited to be talking. I'm in shock. The biggest news, it's just taken, 11 and a half years, the biggest news. I'm so in shock. It's such a big news story. Freo second on the ladder. I could have thought that was going to happen.
I knew the stitch up was coming, right? But do you know what makes do you know what makes that such a beautiful little segue for you? Like, what's that? They're not second on the ladder.
Oh, where are they?
They're third.
No.
so mate, you've been building up for that the whole time, and then you're not even well informed. But I was, you beat me to it because I was actually going to say the last few weeks I've stayed, quiet.
Just on percentage though, you've only lost the one game, haven't you?
Yeah. But Brisbane's got a better percentage than us, so they're second. So.
Oh, okay. All right, my apologies.
But well spotted. Nice for you to acknowledge that. Well done, Freo.
Good team.
I don't get to say that very often. Hey Ben, you're obviously playing on words around the biggest story.
Yes, mate.
In a long time is obviously
all about interest rates.
Interest rates, yeah. So. We obviously want to make sure that our community is informed, and we make sure that we want to protect the mindset of our community. So we've got that covered today. We are going to deep dive on that. And we have brought a very special guest today. You're going to be very, very excited with who we chat to. So we'll introduce our guest shortly. But before we get there, Ben, with interest rates rising, just want to send a message out to our audience because they are a very educated group. And what we want to say to them is stay close to your investment savvy mortgage broker. Now, as you see when we chat later in this episode, there will be further interest rate rises. So nothing to panic and pick up the phone straight away, but stay close to your mortgage broker because you're going to be very, very well prepared if you do. So stick around. I want to encourage everyone to stay around right to the very end of today's episode because if you are feeling what you were saying when we were chatting during the week, Ben, a little butterfly in the stomach that might be feeling because of the interest rate activity, it's very, very important that you strap in and stay away to the end. Hey, my Mindset Minute theme today, Ben, is from Ernest Yaboa. And this is what Ernest said. You don't need to be too anxious about anything. You only need to get understanding. And if you just let that land, there's obviously a bit of anxiety going around now. There's a lot of chatter around what's happened for an interest rate that hasn't happened for a very long time. 1.2 million people have never experienced an interest rate rise before. So you don't need to be too anxious about anything. You only need to get understanding. So we've taken that to heart, Ben. I want that to percolate because we want our whole community to get understanding, and that's why.
So we're going to do interest rates this week, and then next week we're going to do what it means to property prices, so what we think it means to property prices. Because like anyone, we don't know exactly what it's going to mean, but we're going to prosecute positives and negatives in terms of what it means for property prices for the remainder of the year. So I'm looking forward to that chat as well, mate.
Yeah, very much so. Keep calm, folks. Review the facts. Get educated. That is the plan. But Ben, let's cut to our interview that we had today, a little earlier today, with a very special guest. His name is Evan Lucas. Let's hear what he had to say. All right, Ben, we've got a very special guest today. We are talking with Evan Lucas. He is the Chief Strategist at InvestSmart. He's an accomplished financial markets professional, having gained experience at a number of top-tier global institutions. Evan has been investing and researching global markets for over a decade, and after getting his master's in finance, Evan headed to Amsterdam with ABN AMRO before moving to the Royal Bank of Scotland. He returned to Australia with RBS Morgans, where he developed his top-down approach. He's a regular TV commentator. He's the co-host of the Money Cafe podcast He's associated with the Eureka Report and works with Alan Kohler, Paul Clitheroe, and Effie Zahos, who are all friends of the Property Couch. Ben, welcome to the Property Couch, Evan.
Bryce, thank you for having me. This is very exciting for me. This is a topic I don't normally get to talk about, but I do love. So it's really nice to actually be here and particularly talking with you two about it. So it's great.
It's a pleasure to have you on. It's also nice to know that you've tuned into the Property Couch every now and then. But
oh yes.
Hey, listen. Oh, thank you. You are sort of at the peak of your powers with some of the positions that you have. But Evan, it wasn't always that way. Can you tell us what it was like early days, and how did you sort of get into the pathway that you do now have in our markets?
Yeah. So I love that question because this is something I'm actually writing about too. I'm actually writing a book exactly around that point of view. Is about the thing that I love more than anything is behavioral finance. So behavior is absolutely 100% in my view, and I know the two of you are very strong on this as well, how you go about and deal with money. And it doesn't just come from family because it skips generations. It comes from people that influence you, from people that you admire, etc. So in answer to your question there, Bryce, my first start with investing, and it wasn't property, it was investing, was my grandfather. He was actually somebody that started investing back in the 50s and was incredible at it. And he was also one of those quiet achiever investors in the fact that he never really told you much about it. He was almost like that average Australian where they do sort of slightly sit on their hands because the tall poppy syndrome scenario kicks in. He didn't really want to talk about it. And for that reason, actually, I think part of why he didn't necessarily pass it on to his kids, my mum, for example, and my two uncles and my aunt, was he sort of just did it and did it to himself. And by the end of it, when he finally passed, he had a portfolio that was ginormous. But I remember sitting down in around about the mid 90s, watching him literally run through the paper. And remember back in the day where you'd literally open up the business section and every single ticker code with every company was there and the price that it closed. He would go through and mark it off. And I remember sitting there talking to him, what the hell are you doing? And learning from there. And then, I didn't do anything for a long, long time, got into my 20s, started to dabble and started to get excited by it, started to understand, that Australia was a barbell sort of market with BHP at one end and the banks at the other and all those kinds of stuff, and learning from him, and then jumped into it. I came out of uni for a second time, had done my master's in finance and was like, what am I going to do? And then the opportunity with ABN AMRO came up, and that was basically a back of office analyst in their market. And our Dutch market is amazing because it's got ginormous companies and then nothing. So you forget, like before, about 7 years ago, Heineken, before it got bought up by AB InBev, was part of it. Philips, the big ginormous electronic company Philips. You then have the big banks over there, ING, ABN AMRO, which went by the wayside for the global financial crisis, but Randstad, the big HR company. These are the firms that all of a sudden I got my fingers into and learned from a bottom up perspective. But I wanted to come home, and I came home, and then it just went from there. And look, my career has been interesting because coming to you guys, I love property, but it wasn't what I did. And not only that, I know we're going to talk about this, but the other side of it, on the family perspective, somebody that was really, really on me about property was Dad. And I always ignored him on it because back in your 20s, or at least for me anyway, the only thing I cared about was two things: travel and more travel. And I think that's all I did was I saved, got the money, went, had the incredible experiences, came back, did it all over again. And the fastest way I could do that was by investing small amounts of money, making a clip, selling out, and off I went. So I was probably late to the party because my personal psychology was towards what I wanted to do. And again, before I go any further, I think the one thing I want to lay out here, the most intrinsic value of money is gaining time. I think that is an absolutely fundamental point of where you start. All money's job is to do, and it's an asset that transfers things to you, and to transfer time to you is the most important thing, in my view, about money. And whatever you use to invest is up to you. because financial freedom, and more importantly, having choice in financial freedom, is the biggest learning curve, to your question, Bryce, that's come out of this. Is that from when I was 20 to where I am now, and I don't mind telling you, I'm 37, the biggest learn that I've had out of all of that is financial freedom is the biggest incentive from money, from the point of view that if I didn't have and hadn't learned that from all of the things that I've gone through, I don't think you'll ever get there. And it's all about gaining time. And I now have more flexibility, more time in my life than I've ever had, because my money gives me that flexibility.
Oh, so much to unpack.
There you go.
Yeah. So much to lean in on.
All right, so I'll start. I want to go back to your family dinner table. So obviously, the knowledge isn't passed on from your grandfather.
Yep.
But your mother is one of four.
Yep.
She just obviously they're living comfortably. There's probably no worries there.
Well, actually, I'm going to interrupt you. So this is the interesting thing about mum is that the other things to talk about, you're never too late to start. And she finally started in 2020. So the pandemic finally kicked her into gear, because she's been saying to me for almost 20 years, I need to start. I know I need to do it. I'll get around to it, blah, 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 blah. And it was constant. There was always a reason it wasn't done. And then finally she started. She gave me a lump sum. Again, I'm not going to tell you how old she is, but she's approaching a level that requires retirement. She's worked very hard her entire life and probably needs to do that. And she finally realized, and she started it. And once it happened, it was instantaneous. It was a click. This is so much easier than I expected. And she's contributing every month. She's putting not a huge amount of money, but enough every month. And she's, averaging herself up. She's now got several properties, an investment portfolio, and her super. And I finally managed to you need to look at that as a whole, right? They're not individual pieces. I call it the elephant paradigm. You eat an elephant one bite at a time, but you need to remember it's still an elephant, right? So your entire wealth is the elephant. Beautiful. And that all of a sudden came back to her. And so mum started. And so that was the part of that story there, Ben, in terms of...
No, it's a good segue. So coming back to, because am I right? Have I recorded correctly that you grew up in Adelaide?
I did grow up in Adelaide, yeah.
Yeah, so you're in Adelaide, you're growing up, I'm sure pretty comfortable. But what was the money conversations around the dinner table for you, your mum, and your family generally? Were they classical sort of, we don't talk about it?
Yep.
And so
and not only that, again, my parents won't be upset with me talking about this, because my old man is really open about this. Dad had an episode in 2001 with depression. So he had a huge life crisis. His brother died of a heart attack. A few other things happened, and his whole sort of structure of his world sort of went. And he ended up in the Adelaide clinic, and he's very open about this. He actually goes and talks about it at discussions. So not only that, just to point out, that period of time, myself and my sister were at school, and we were in secondary school. I was a year, 2 years away from doing year 12. My sister was about 4 or 5 years away, and mum made the decision in her head to not put that kind of burden on us and not put the financial discussions that they were having onto us either. So I've always, in retrospect and hindsight, whatever word you want to use, was that good or bad? I don't know, from the point of view that we didn't get that discussion. And now I go the other way. I sit there and go, Mum, you need to talk about this. You need to actually open up and understand. You need to talk about your money, but not just that, understand where you sit. And again, I get back to that thing that I said before, the elephant paradigm. She sometimes, and still a lot of people I talk to about this, can't see their whole wealth position as one. They see their cash position. They see their property position. They see their portfolio position. And if you look at them in individual and you go, that's all I've got, you're always going to be behind, because you're never going to reach the potential you think you've got, and you're consistently moving your goalposts. So yeah, getting back to that question, no. What I'll also...
but it also makes sense, right? I mean, look, your health is your wealth, right? And if someone in your inner sanctum is not going well, you really don't need to put any additional burden into that story, right? So your mum's got you 2 kids in high school.
Yeah.
She's trying to really just survive, get through this, support her husband, the man she loves. So I'm thinking, if anyone else is in a similar situation, don't think that, money's going to solve that problem either, right? I mean,
it won't.
it potentially just adds a little bit of extra stress. So coming back to your time question, maybe that's not a good time to be looking to invest if you're thinking about that type of thing.
But the way to look at it in another way is to understand that if those unfortunate scenarios that I experienced happen, that you're ready for it.
Yeah, the defense piece.
Yeah, and it's even more than that. It's understanding that it doesn't have to be a health issue. It could be, being made redundant. It could be all of a sudden finding yourself in a scenario where you're not earning as much as you were before. That it doesn't matter from the point of view that your money is there to support you today, tomorrow, and beyond. And that what we as human beings can't do psychologically is rationalize time, right? And in terms of the example I always use, when we were building a house, doing our renovation, you don't go to your builder and say, how much is it going to cost? It's $200,000 for the renovation. Here's $200K. It doesn't happen like that. You pay in increments. Your life happens in times of increments too. You're today, you're tomorrow, and you're beyond. And if your money is set up in that when tomorrow comes, and the tomorrow being a down day, unfortunately, rather than an up day, your money's there. Your financial freedom is there waiting across those periods of time. So that's how I look at it, is what I learned from that was that. And then also getting back to my original answer from Bryce was where I learned about money was when all of a sudden I went overseas and lived overseas, and it's just you being 18, or the next time was when I was 24, and understanding that your money all of a sudden is something you need to pay attention to, rather than the fact that your parents were probably giving it to you, or that you're, doing a job at McDonald's or Boost Juice or whatever it was, and was just getting pocket money that you can then go and spend it on an Xbox game. All of a sudden your situation changes. And that's how I learned. That's how I learned to grow up quick.
You grow up quick.
Well, what were the lessons when you're overseas? Because you said grandfather was from observation, you saw stuff, but there was no conversations. You've just said that over your dinner table, there was no direct conversation. So what were you learning? Was it all osmosis? And then when you actually did land in Europe, and then you did have all these independent challenges that you needed to navigate, what were you referring to? What were you leaning on? What was it that did you blow it, or did you?
Yeah, good point. Yeah, so no, I didn't blow it. So I've always been a person, and again, everybody's different. I've always been a person back then, and I still sort of am to some extent, that I can only use what I have. And I'm sort of lucky in that I actually sometimes, to my own detriment too, if I went to a point where I was all out, I would sit on myself and sort of live quite skintily when I was over there. I mean, 2003 for me was that year, in terms of I went on a gap year. As soon as I finished school, off I went, massive rose-colored glasses about the year, but I was earning £77.50 a week. That's how much I was earning, okay? And I had free accommodation and free food. And it's the best year of my life I've ever had in terms of my own individual experience, because I still managed to go from Denmark all the way down to Italy, through Germany, the Czech Republic, Austria, Switzerland, France, and in Italy over 5 weeks on £900. Because I could budget, because I could do all the experience, and I didn't miss a beat. I didn't miss anything. I still went bungee jumping in Switzerland. I still went on the big experiences for Munich, for Oktoberfest, all those kinds of things. Didn't miss out, still £900. But it was learning that how to budget, how to spend, what was important, what wasn't important. And getting to your question about, learning by osmosis with my grandfather, the thing that was really interesting is that when I got to a point in my career where I was starting to really hit my straps and coming into this industry, I all of a sudden was getting a phone call from him going, Evan, what should I do? I'm like, I shouldn't be getting that question from you. I should be asking you that question. And that was the fascinating thing, was all of a sudden to have Grampy call me going, Rio Tinto is doing some sort of share buyback. Do I do it? What's in, should I be continuing to do dividend reinvestment plans? All these kinds of questions, ANZ's come out with this result, the net interest margins are X. Does that mean that I should sell it now? All those kind of questions were coming from him to me. And I'm like, Gramps, you've been doing this for 30 years. I want your information about how you'd process that, because your portfolio, I know what it is now. And he finally showed it to me, that I'd be like, there is a reason it's got to this level. It's because of your experience, because of your understanding. And you never stop learning. And even though this is what I did for a living, I was like, I know, I want to understand what you would do and why.
And just, I need to close that loop, right? Was he active, passive, growth? What type of investor did he have? A
stock picker, so an active guy.
So active guy. And what was he looking for? Was he looking for the classics, leadership team, gap in market, PE rate? What was his sort of triggers?
No, it was more than that. It was more about what is Australia's economy, right? So he'd been investing in BHP since basically the 60s.
And that's a big piece.
Yeah, exactly. And so, as soon as CBA was listing in 1994, bang, he was all over it.
$2.50, I think they listed for, something like that.
Yes, they was. And then you had, oh no, it might have been $4.60.
I think you're right. Yep.
Telstra was $2.30.
That's where it was. $2.30 came from Telstra, but he got all three tranches of T1, T2, T3.
Yeah.
He did get CSL. He understood the advantages of CSL, but CSL didn't come to its own until probably about 2015. I mean,
after I sold it.
I mean, I remember having a big argument with a friend of mine when I was working for RBS in 2011 about CSL was sitting at $43 and it wasn't doing anything. It wasn't going anywhere. And I remember saying to him, I said, this is probably the greatest company Australia has ever produced.
Mm-hmm.
It's just not fully valued yet. I said, the technology, the understanding, the global footprint, the ability now that time they were starting to monster Baxter, absolutely monster them. And I said, this is going to become the greatest company Australia's ever produced in high intellectual technology, high intellectual property. And okay, I've been proven right, and I'm sort of blowing my own trumpet. But in saying that, again, looking at what he was doing, all he cared about was that he just kept adding to it. Right. And so his growth, the growth in that
time
company,
and increments.
It's just the Warren Buffett trend. Again, before I go any further, the greatest thing you could ever learn is the eighth wonder of the world, according to Einstein, which is compound interest. Right. And compounding just means adding to your positions and allowing it to do what it does.
Evan, we want to talk to you about the biggest story this week, which is around interest rates. But before we do, there's one thing that you said before, which was the focus for you is gaining time. Can we just talk a little bit about that, because I don't think it's spoken about enough. Because quite often the I guess the focus is around possessions, acquisition, things, right? And you've just talking about something that not enough people speak about, and I just want to lean in on that. At 37 years of age, why has that been an epiphany for you early, when a lot of people double your age probably haven't got that epiphany yet?
Yeah, still don't see it. I think the epiphany came when there was a disruption in my sort of timeline. And what I mean by that is I got to a point where the other thing that is probably, again, this is my behavioral finance hat going on very strongly. The other core thing about the average person is autonomy, right? Your ability to have autonomy. And it's big in psychology, is the ability to have control over one's destiny is absolutely huge. And I had a period in my life, I'm not going to go through that scenario because I want to keep that out, but where all of a sudden I worked out very quickly, I had zero control. The autonomy that I had was zero. And my life experience was the lowest I've ever had. And I'm a really positive person, very confident. And I know I am. And I'm open about that, really open about where I sit. Because I think if you can be open, again, it gets back to your question, Bryce, about understanding time. So I'd lost my ability to have autonomy. I'd lost my ability to control my destiny. And then what came with that is that I realized that although I had money, I hadn't put it into a scenario that was giving me the ability to deal with discontinues, to deal with changes to my thought process, that my career was linear, that I was doing X, Y, Z, that I was always going to move up. All those kinds of things was what happened in terms of learning that experience. And it was therefore about, hang on a minute, I want to start gaining time. I have a beautiful wife that I was married to. We were starting to have that family scenario. We were starting to move into areas that actually became that, not just more important, but understanding that I wanted that to be my, part of my life. It wasn't to, the old adage of I didn't want to live to work. I wanted to work to live, but also understanding value and the value that you are to certain people or certain organizations and blah, blah, blah. And that's all came to this idea that I worked out very quickly from that quick position that gaining time is the most important asset that money can give you. And having the ability that if something changes, I don't know, you want to go like I am, go and write a book, or go and do, a year away to, do an experience. If it's to sit down and actually reassess, change career, that is gaining time. That's what I mean by gaining time. And that is that your money can actually not only support you, but it's what it's there for. One of the things that someone like Effie Zohos uses, which is a very, very common saying, is you don't want to die the richest person in the cemetery. Like, there's no reason just to continue to accumulate wealth to get to when you die and just go, you still need to use it. I'm not saying spend it to the hilt and go and get yourself a credit card and leverage yourself up. That's definitely not what I'm saying. But understand that money is just a transfer of value product. It's all it's doing. Buying a house, buying a car, that's all well and good. It's also about buying time that gives you the flexibility to live what will be a much, much more open life, in my view anyway.
We refer to it as lifestyle by design.
Yeah, good one.
Like ultimately, that's the,
that's beautiful.
That's our mission in terms of where we're taking the podcast around money management, property, and investing. It's designing lifestyle. And money is a means to an end. It's not the end.
Yes.
And having excess amounts of it does not give you happiness. We also know that through our studies of what creates happiness. So I think that's, we're all on the same page there.
Yeah,
let's land that plane for everyone, Evan. So someone's listening to that and they've said, that sounds amazing. How does that manifest on a weekly, monthly basis to you? Are you buying back time where you're saying, I'm not part of the everyday home to work to home, so I've got time to invest in my family, my children? Or are you saying I'm buying back the horizon of when I'm actually moving into the retirement phase? What does that actually mean for you today?
Yep. So it's a bit of both. And I think that also needs, again, as I said, today, tomorrow, and beyond is how I sort of try and put it out there and think about it. So there's today's money, which is probably your income, and understanding that income can come from lots of different spaces. It's tomorrow, which means that, 3 to 5 years, where do I financially sit? And that requires a little bit of investing, a little bit of savviness on that point, and then beyond. That is everything else. In my view, beyond is, don't forget, your house is an asset, right? It's a beautiful asset. It's an asset that's tangible. You can touch it, you can change it, but it also has value in it. It's your investment properties. It is your growth portfolio, or whatever that might be. And it's there at every step of the way. So that therefore brings my retirement forward if I want it. But it also means that next week, if I need to take a day off work and not get paid for it, I've got tomorrow's money to help me. If I want to look at having and working from home, I mean, the advantages of COVID, I think the biggest advantage is understanding that your flexibility of work is there if you use it to your advantage. Your employer, and I've got a beautiful employer, let me just put that out there, InvestSmart are amazing in terms of what they're, so that is an advantage I have that I know some people don't. But in saying that, I can always, I don't have to find time. Time is just there because of how I set myself out. I think that's the way to answer it.
Beautiful.
Nice.
I mean, ultimately, what we're all trying to do is substitute out our exertion income for our passive income in some respects. Now, but even when you do sub it out completely in terms of obviously that full exertion income being employed and spending and donating your time for a return on money.
Yep.
When you get to passive income, there's still amount of exertion. Like, you're not going to let it completely, you're not going to let that property just basically go and not respond to the property manager, keep the tenants happy. You're not going to let your portfolio not get reviewed. You're not going to look at the annual financials or the quarterly results or something like that. You're still going to keep some tension on that, but you do get a hell of a lot more time. You know, when you're not using that sort of 40 to 60 hours of exertion for full-time employment. So I think that's...
And sort of to that further, Ben, I think that's a beautiful way of putting it. I would also say to you that the exertion on that is that it's keeping you active, it's keeping your mind active, it's keeping you involved in your space. And again, don't ever disconnect the idea that actually it can become not just the hobby's not a correct word. It's more about it becomes an enjoyment to actually see it go both ways. That your passive income and your passive portfolio can actually bring your ability to bring that exertion, as using your word, which I think is a beautiful word, because it means that you keep your mind active. It keeps you involved with the whole game and understanding that actually this is giving me time. It is giving me my enjoyment. It is giving me everything that I was hoping for. And all of a sudden, those other things that probably do matter more than money, because I think there is definitely something more enjoyable than money.
Oh, there is lots.
That comes to you in just such an easier way. And I think it's a beautiful thing.
Hey, you talked a bit about grandfather. You just rattled off a bunch of well-known shares. Where does property fit into the picture for you, Evan? Is it clearly you live in your own home, but what about it as an investment vehicle? How does it rank for you?
Right up there. So I do have one as well. So I'll again, being completely honest and being transparent, I have one. I don't have more than that. Again, I'll be honest with you. As I said to you with regards to my opening story, is that I was late to the property sort of environment. My own house, I've owned two houses. So I've had the one that I'm currently sitting in and the one before that, I basically was the start. And what I mean by that is that the leapfrog that it gave me to my financial freedom was huge. So my wife and I, we did incredibly well. We are very happy to get our hands dirty and do the renovation, did it up. We somehow managed to sell the thing the first weekend of Melbourne's second lockdown. So think about that. We got 3 weeks of showing, which was fantastic, but we were one of the first to do virtual auctions. And so that was an experience in itself, but we didn't miss out. And as we know, the property market has just kept going. And again, the advantage of property is, as I said to you before, it's tangible, it's touchable. It's something that you can do with, you can change, you can, all starts and mannerisms. And again, the other thing that behavioral psychology and the behavioral finance side of it, in the end, don't forget, property is not just a market. It is also a thing that people need, right? Living and shelter is what housing is. Shelter is something that we all need. And therefore, the reasonings to go into property also vary for that reason. So it is always going to, this is why when you hear this, the story about crashing markets and blah, 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 the underlying thing about markets is that there is, in property, is that there's always an underlying level of demand, because it's not just about simple economics and rational economics. Property has an underlying demand that will always be there because people are having families, expanding, downsizing, upsizing. There is always a level of demand that will always be there that will stop the worst case scenario that you're going to hear in the media, because it's a different beast. And that's what's, I mean, the one thing, I mean, I'm sure you guys use something similar. Somebody kept asking me, going, what should I do? A couple of years ago, COVID, 2020, property market was going to crash by 34% according to CBA when they scorched earth scenario. And I remember somebody bailing me up going, what should I do? And I said, well, here's a question for you. If I came home and I stuck a big neon sign above your house and said, this is the value of it today, and then in 2 weeks' time, I walked back and said, what is it today? And had that same neon sign flash up the value and it had fallen by 10%, would you sell? Would you sell your house? Well, no, I wouldn't. Well, I said, well, then what's the problem? And this is the psychology of it, right? Is that when you see the rational, cold, hard numbers, it looks scary. But when you think about the reasonable side of it, it's a completely different story. And property, like everything, is something you're not going to just buy today and sell in a year's time. You're probably going to buy and maybe sell in 5 years' time, more likely 10 years' time. And so the story of time is everything we're talking about at the moment is that you've got that ability to weather downside markets, because assets will continue to appreciate. That's a given.
I think it's important. I think that's an important message for people to sort of let percolate in their mind as we've had a big story this week, because it is the only investment in market in the world that's not dominated by investors for the reasons that you just talked about. And so when stuff happens, people will, for as long as we get uncomfortable in our seat and we shuffle just to get more comfortable, we will continue to do that around our principal place of shelter as well. So which I guess is a nice segue for what has actually happened this week. And we obviously want to get your expertise on that. But the Reserve Bank has increased the interest rates for the first time in more than 11 years with a 25 basis point hike, taking the cash rate target to 0.35%. Governor Lowe made some interesting comments, said the combination of recent very high inflation numbers and evidence that workers were starting to get bigger wage increases as a result of a low 4% unemployment rate meant that the time was right for normalising interest rates away from
that word, don't you?
Emergency lows, normalizing interest rates. He said, this is a quote, "The board is committed to doing what is necessary to ensure that inflation in Australia returns to target over time." He noted in his post-meeting statement, this will require a further lift in interest rates over the period ahead. What's been your digest of, obviously, for some people listening to this who've never experienced an interest rate rise in their property ownership lifetime?
One of 1.2 million people.
What's the number?
1.2 million people from November 2010 to yesterday have been a first owner, occupier, purchaser. So 1.2 million people have never experienced an interest rate rise until yesterday. So that needs to be pointed out in terms of, May 3rd, mark the day. That's the change in that space. And what is very interesting, I've got to point this out very straight and forward, is that Goverlow's right. We had emergency level monetary policy. So having 0.1 of 1% in the current economic environment was ridiculous. And I don't use that word lightly, because it needs to be pointed out that inflation is running really hard. And I'll come to that in a minute. So the three mandates of a central bank, not just the RBA, but anywhere you want to pick, is basically three things. What we call price stability, that's inflation, making sure prices stay relatively consistent year on year so that you're not having shocks, which is sort of what we're going through at the moment. The second one is what they call full employment, the unemployment rate, and what we call underemployment, which is those that are employed but want to work more, then the underutilization rate, which is the combination of the unemployment rate and the underemployment rate, getting to a level that is actually starting to be so low that it's driving wages up, which is part of the inflation story. You want that to get to equilibrium. Again, call that what you will. And the final and third thing is normal economic activity. And that means that the economy is growing. It's growing relatively neatly. It's not collapsing. It's not expanding at a really hot rate that causes sorts of different issues. So they're the three mandates. That's what I know. That's the catch for them, is that they're using a tool that is a sledgehammer to do fine art. So interest rate rises affect everything in terms of what we're doing. So it's not just your home loan, it's the business loan, it's your personal loan, it's your credit card loan. All of those things all of a sudden move by a very blunt interest rate moving up and down. And the board knows this. And that's why when you listen to them, they tend to be very conservative people, because they understand that pulling levers like this affects so many different things in so many different ways, positively and negatively. And so your question, Bryce, around experiencing that jump. So let's have a look at what happened. I think what you need to look at is that the average mortgage holder in Australia is just shy of $500,000. Yesterday's numbers will see about a $57 jump for $500,000 per month. So it's a bit, and it will certainly start to make you think, but it's not a huge mover. What will probably be a huge mover is what they're now forecasting, which is that they're going to raise rates probably a few more times. Now, again, depends on who you listen to about this, and there are some big, bloody, scary expectations out there that they're going to raise rates really quickly. Don't forget those three mandates, right? You can control price stability all you want, but if price stability is the only goal, the impact it'll have on the other two is also something to be telling. So just remember that already forward-looking, what we call forward-looking indicators, business confidence, consumer confidence, has already started to go backwards quite rapidly. So consumer confidence fell by 6% in April. Business confidence fell by 3% in April, and it hadn't even started yet.
Evan, it is an interesting point, right? Because what's different about this time around, and I think, it's how we look at this from a mindset point of view. Bryce and I were sort of talking about this the other day when we caught up. I said, it's like there's a little butterfly in your belly, and especially for those 1.2 million homeowners, it's just that feeling of uncertainty. Nothing like a pandemic arriving, mind you, but just enough to feel that. But how do you steady that ship in terms of, well, it's about the narrative that you tell yourself. So we're at emergency level 0.1 of 1% interest rates. So if we tell ourselves the story, the governor was pressed pretty hard in the post-announcement interview that I studied quite interestingly last night. And I liked his idea about neutral rates being around 2.5. So cash rate, neutral rate around 2.5. That's where he's trying to get inflation down to 2.5. So that's the neutral rate that the market's going to be paying. Now, we've just gone to 0.35 of 1%.
Yep.
Now, So you can look at it, this is, okay, now I've got a real increase in costs, or you can actually flip it on its head from a mindset point of view and say, I was just getting a bargain. Like the reality was with full employment, I was getting a bargain. I got money that I probably shouldn't have got in a normal situation.
Yeah.
If there was no pandemic and you said to me, and here's the question for you, right? If there was no pandemic and I said to you that unemployment was 4%, where do you think the cash rate would be sitting if you were still in control of inflation?
So back before, so February 2020, the cash rate was in the ones. It was about 1.5%. We had just been through near enough to 30 months of inaction from the RBA because inflation had not been inside that band you're alluding to, Ben, since the third quarter of 2015.
Correct.
So that was our problem. We had this sort of really stagnant growth scenario.
We couldn't budge wages. Couldn't budge wages, so we wouldn't meet it.
But if all of a sudden something had caused unemployment to fall to 4%, and you'd all of a sudden, that would lead to incredible fast movement in growth, it would have jacked up inflation pretty quickly. So we wouldn't have been sitting in a one handle. We would have been sitting probably minimum high twos, probably more likely threes in terms of the interest rate that the cash rate would have been at. So just using that hypothetical and eyeballing that, we probably would have been about 3.25% to 3.5% where we were back then. Because don't forget, leading into February 2020, 2019 was a really good year. People forget that. 2019 was actually a relatively good year.
We were moving, our momentum, our economy was actually starting to really kick into gear. If we hadn't had the pandemic, we were on a property rise anyway.
Yeah.
Not at the levels that we saw because interest rates came down, but momentum was in our favor.
Yeah, I remember sitting in February 2020 talking about the idea that once the pandemic came, because we were, as you said, property was peaking. Yep. The demand level for property in 2019 was getting to a level that you hadn't seen. And that was really interesting because, again, you'd had since 2013 to 2017, you had a banking-led recovery in the economy. Incredible recovery in terms of what was going on. And bank stocks were killing it. And you could tell that. Not only that, the amount of money that they were lending was incredible because people understood and had the confidence to go and do this. And you're right. The last 2 years have been this free kick in terms of how you look at it because we had no idea. I mean, okay, we need to remember this. Nobody has correctly called the pandemic, period. That is an absolute given. Forecasters on the health side, forecasters on the economic side have already said they need to really evaluate what they've done and how they've done it. And again, studying what happened yesterday with the RBA, it was amazing to hear Glenn Stevens physically say that we need to review our forecasting because it was embarrassing, and that was his word, embarrassingly wrong. You do not hear a reserve banker say that without it being really, really important. And so that's where you're at.
So pick up that story, right? So for me, he was, obviously, again, they're very conservative. They've got to be very sensitive in terms of what they say. They can move markets. They can move exchange rates. They can move anything with the slip of a tongue. And he was poked and prodded by the journalists around where was he going to see, where is that neutral rate level? Now, he didn't quite answer the question, but every time he expanded on his point, it was around that sort of 2.5 level. Yep. So I think that's a signaling for me around, I don't disagree with you. I think if we get back to that level, so flip that mindset on its head, we've been getting cheap money longer than we expected it to. We would have never have gone down to that level without the pandemic. So all of a sudden, whatever the $240 additional billion that we've got in household savings, we've got an extra $3 or $4 grand or $6 grand or 10 grand, depending on your situation, that you didn't expect to have. So if the mindset stays there and unemployment stays at a low level, I'm getting this natural shock, this little spike feeding through consumer confidence and sort of potentially business confidence. But where to from here, in your view, once we digest and say, actually, the economy's pretty phenomenal. Like we have got a pretty hot economy that we should be reasonably proud of. I mean, we're about to get into a 3 read probably this month.
Yeah, we are. We will. So my read on it is this: understand that everything has cycles. So that, I think the other part of this is we're going to go through all sort of cycles. We are in a very positive thing right now, and I completely agree with that assessment. The other thing to be reminded of is that, again, going back to what I spoke to both of you about before, the eighth wonder of the world, according to Einstein, is compound, right? So compound interest is also applied to your home loan. So again, your repayments, I mean, particularly if you had a loan before you went into the pandemic, all that happened was that the interest that you were paying went down, right? You probably didn't change your repayments per month or per fortnight or whatever it is that you're doing. So you're paying off your principal at a much, much better rate. And that's a really important thing, is that all that's going to change is the interest that you're paying is going to get a little bit more expensive. You should also then be thinking, okay, I've still got time to renegotiate my interest rate. So all of those things, that's just money planning. Second part of your question, Ben, with regards to looking forward, is that the economy does need to slow a little bit. Let's make that very clear, is that at the moment, it is going quite hot. We have some serious demand-led problems, also supply-led problems, and that also needs to be very clear. But we are consuming at levels that we are well and truly above what we normally do because, as you said, we've got more money than we expected. All it means is understanding that your budgeting for tomorrow is slightly more, and it doesn't have to change much either. So again, let's use the examples I used before. Let's take a $750,000 mortgage, and let's say they're going to do what the market is telling us that it's going to do, which is really quite extreme by December. The market believes the cash rate will be at 2.75%. It's actually 2.76.5%, but let's just round it down to make it bloody easier. That would mean that the standard variable rate today, which was moved up from what happened yesterday to 5.1, would go up to 7.5%. That would mean you would need roughly around about $307 a week extra for that $750,000 mortgage. So that sounds like a lot, and I'm not denying that it is. But when you equate that to what you are probably earning inside of it, it's something you can live with. It's not just that, it probably will mean that your overall growth profile is crimped, but not collapsing. And that's what they're trying to do. They're just trying to crimp you a little bit to slow you down from over leveraging, from over expanding into a scenario where you are buying too many cars or you are buying too much XYZ. So you're right. It's a mind-setting change. Economically, business is expanding quite well. It's likely that you've had a wage price increase because we can see that already. The employment market is expanding at a level that probably also means that if you wanted to look around, you could. All of those things have come to you now because of what's happened. And having a rising interest rate environment is actually a positive because it means that, as you said, the economy is doing very, very well. We just need to make sure that it doesn't go very well and then falls off a cliff. It keeps going.
So don't tighten too quickly because you run that risk of killing confidence, killing momentum.
Yeah.
So that's a perfect segue into his commentary. I hadn't heard this before. His inflation psychology. I'll start with the way down where he was talking about this whole idea that when you're playing with monetary policy, you've got to instill confidence. So the board took the view that saying that interest rates weren't going to change till 2024 would give confidence to the market to invest, business to invest, which led to employment, to lead to where they were. But they were getting told at the time unemployment was going to go to 15%, that we were going to have scars on this for decades, was the language that he was using. So we're coming out the other side. So now, though, the psychology goes the different way, doesn't it? It's actually exactly what you were just talking about before around telling people slow down a little bit, because if the businesses still believe that you got money to spend, they'll continue to push inflation higher.
Yeah, they will. And so again, using those terms, which is exactly what he's trying to do, just because the market is telling you that it could get to 2.76% by the end of December doesn't mean it's going to happen. Because the other thing that we forget when we talk about inflation, it's a rolling number. And what I mean by that is that when we look at year on year, it's the last 52 weeks. So all of a sudden, the 52 weeks from April 2021, they roll off, right? So we have seen an incredible upside in 2021, like the inflation movement in 2021, growth in 2021 was incredible. So those 13% numbers that you've seen in, for instance, construction, right? Construction, let's use that as an example. It's 13.5%, 14%
oil,
increase.
35%. Yep.
Bingo. That's not going to happen again this year, right? We're not going to see a 34% jump in oil this year. I mean, unless, well, actually, that's not true. That could happen if Russia did something really incredible. Let's take the construction. Let's use a much more stable example. Yeah. Construction isn't going to continue to jump by 13%. So that is going to roll out, as we call it, of the inflation data. So we might be going right now at 5.1% and 3.7% on a trim mean basis. And we may get to 4.75% on a core basis, as the RBA says. But that data will roll out. Everything that we saw at the end of 2021, New South Wales coming out of COVID, Victoria coming out of COVID, the FOMO that everybody was having with regards to that thing, all of that data will roll out. And what that means is that all of a sudden inflation will come back much, much faster than I think is currently being predicted. And for that reason, that's why when you see those big, scary scenarios that we've just discussed, they may not actually eventuate, because the board will turn around and go, actually, inflation's come back to the level we want it to be much, much quicker than we expected. Psychologically, you slowed yourself down. That's a tick. That's what we wanted you to do. But we don't have to go as hard on you as we expected. Happy days. So again, it's that continuum of trying to make sure that they control the three things: price stability, full employment, economic activity. And it is about the levers that they can use is, telling you something, communication. And the one that's been the best at leading on this is the US Federal Reserve. I mean, I am an absolute nerd for it with regards to listening to what they talk about. And don't worry out there if you listen to this, don't worry too much about it. But they communicate constantly. And the communication is actually market moving, as Ben alluded to, for good reasons in their view, because it means they don't have to actually physically move money to make you stop. They can make you stop by telling you, or they can make you spend by telling you. So that's the other part of this discussion.
So in terms of, you talked before about the war in Ukraine, so that's obviously having an impact. But some of the inflation stuff that we're wearing now is largely coming from overseas, right? Supply constraints, the price of commodities, fuel, all those sorts of things. So do you see that is a trend that will continue to be the flip side of that data rolling out?
Yes. So I'm going to go back a little bit further before I answer your question, Bryce, because I think you need to. So the other thing about monetary policy, it's a demand inflation inhibitor or expander. So if you think about it, it's trying to control your demand for goods. It's trying to control your demand for, a new house, a new car, consumption of supplying goods. That's all well and good if demand inflation is what's driving inflation. And don't get me wrong, it is, right? It definitely is. But you're right, Bryce. Supply is the other side of this. And so you can pull all you want on demand side inflation. If supply inflation remains elevated because of issues, China's zero policy on COVID, Southeast Asia still having massive issues around employment and actually getting people back to doing what they need to do, semiconductors in Taiwan still not being done, all those kinds of issues, that isn't fixable. So that is the caveat to this. And what I mean by that is that the China story, I think at the moment from most people, is slightly misunderstood about how dramatic it could get and how fast it could unwind. And what I mean by that is that do not underestimate how important October will be for the Chinese Communist Party. If President Xi is confirmed for his third term of 5 years, he, I think, will actually unleash. I think he'll actually rip the Band-Aid off, expand like China was always known, and all of a sudden you'd see a bit of a turnaround. But that's another story. It's more about supply constraints are going to be something we're going to have to live with for a little while. And by a little while, I mean at least another 2 years. There is no doubt, you look at lumber. Lumber's a great sort of benchmark and barometer for how things are going. It's come back, but it is still well and truly elevated to pre-COVID levels. And that therefore crimps really important parts of the economy, like construction. From my view, if you ever want to look at a barometer, just look at a tradie. And why I say that is that they are the first people to get employed, but the first people out. They're also the first people to see really big jumps up in their income, but really big downsides when it slows down. And they're a microcosm for the economy because of that. So you can see if tradies all of a sudden you start seeing construction sites empty, or you start seeing tradies and subcontractors starting to ask for work, that's an indicator, in my view, in terms of exactly what we're talking about, is that something's happened and supply side is clear. So you look at ProBuild, it's just, again, it's a micro idea, but it shows you that the costs of supply is another constraint that isn't necessarily controlled by increasing or decreasing interest rates.
I want to pick up on your point before around how data rolls off. For those who are not nerds like us in this sort of stuff, the same sort of thing occurs. So when we talk about 35% oil and basically that number rolling off, technically, the CPI is a read on the change from that previous period, whether it be last quarter or annualized
last
or whatever.
year or whatever.
Yeah. So what is also of emphasis here is that you go back to zero from that moment forward. Like, in other words, once you bake in that 35% oil increase and you bake in that 13%, what you were saying before about that is that the next time you actually look at that, it's got to be further increases to actually show an additional increase. And I think the other good one there is Labor sort of playing up to this and sort of saying, next year you're only going to see 2% GDP growth. Well, yeah, that's because the read has been so pretty good for the last 12 years. Really, really robust. I mean, you're running an economy in Australia, a developed economy like us, that really doesn't have the expansion like China does have, where they're trying to take people out of poverty into a higher standard of living. Getting 4% GDP is actually a pretty healthy economy.
That's incredibly healthy. For a population of 25 million people, it's incredibly healthy.
So we are sitting here wealthier than we've ever been, more cashed up than we've ever been, fully employed than we've ever been. We've got more females in the workforce than ever. In fact, we've got actually more people working ever. We've got almost ticking over our record number in terms of participation rate. And also, we talked about not having enough work. That's also radically changing in terms of, that underemployment. So all of those indicators on the employment side are really solid. And I think for me, that's a bit of the messaging about stay calm, look at the fundamental things. And in fact, be of the understanding that we're actually trying to bring the economy back a little bit, so the inflation genie doesn't keep going.
So further to that point, and getting to what you guys do and talking to what your clients listen to, what you've just explained about the employment needs to also be remembered is that Australia is quite a unique country in the fact that we have a population of 25 million people on a piece of the planet that's the sixth largest country on the planet. And why I highlight that is that because you need to be close to where you work. So demand, again, for things like property, for shelter to actually be able to go to work is always going to be quite high. So if you look at what that also therefore means, and what you're saying, Ben, and I completely agree with it, is that don't panic on the idea that all of a sudden you're going to get this collapse of the housing market because interest rates are going up. That's not how it's going to work. And what I mean by that is that if you do have a full employment market like we do, competition is high. So therefore, you might actually start seeing businesses do what they did over in sort of Port Hedland, for example, where they're actually flying you in and paying your rent to live in those spaces. All those kinds of things are certainly not out of the question. And you're already seeing it. So the Pacific scenario with fry and fruit workers is a really small example. But all of a sudden, you have employers that are paying their rent, they're paying their obligations. Why the regions in places like the Food Bowl in Victoria or up in central New South Wales are seeing a really interesting boom in housing because there is work to be had there. People are coming to that region for that work. And therefore, the ability to attract workers comes down to additional incentives like that. And that is where markets, particularly in property, are so interesting because they have so many factors that pull into them. So that is the other take out of this in terms of not panicking, is don't forget that the economy is still moving and it will continue to move forward. And as you said about that rolling, we may only grow at 2% next year, but the main thing to remember is that we've almost completely recovered the dip that we got from COVID. And if you look at that chart that you were talking about, Ben, where you take out the year on year and the percentage move, blah, 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 and actually look at the dollar amount from when basically these results started, which was around about when Australia was founded. And, you can even go back to 1788 when sort of European settlement happened. really started about the 1850s, you can see that it just keeps going like this. And then there's all of a sudden this thing that just went dink, and now it's back to where we are.
Yeah. Reverts back to its mean.
Yeah.
Yep.
So we're back to the 2% growth that we should be used to.
Yeah.
And I think there's an important point there that Australia's superpower is what you talked about before, the fact that we've got this empty island, we're a large mass, we've got a small amount of population relative to its size, and we are stable and attractive for a whole bunch of reasons, including what we've seen over the last couple of years. And so we've had all this performance in our economy and in our property markets on the back of planes not landing at the rates that they were before, and that will resume at some point. So, and then we have all these urban centres that are sort of highly localised around these capital cities, which the pandemic has challenged a little bit. But so you've got all these people will eventually land here. Their goal will be to buy property. We go back to what we talked about earlier around the fact that housing is the only investment market not dominated by investors. We strap in when we need to make sure it's secure. So those are all very good reasons for everyone, I think, to remain positive, despite the fact that the headlines all this week are around interest rate rises, and it sells newspapers. But my question for you is one of the questions that people will be having is, should I fix or should I go variable? Do you have a view on that?
Yes. So again, I like the answer I said before. Compound interest is the absolute winner here, right? So the whole idea of how you should be structuring anything that you do for investment property is a little bit different, but for your own property, debt that you can't use in other ways from an investment perspective, you should be trying to get that down as fast as you can. That's always a given, right? So in terms of fixed and variable, unfortunately, this also gets down to the idea that you need to understand the banking space and understand how banking treasuries work and how they finance themselves to sort of understand my question here. I'm going to get a little bit high level, so I do apologize on this. Fixed income in this country, or fixed mortgages, are normally done where the bank itself goes and hedges. And what I mean by that is they go and actually buy the opposing sort of debt that you're borrowing in some other market. And the majority of that happens in the States. The States market has already moved. So that's why fixed mortgages basically have been moving for the last sort of 6 months. So if you look at the fixed rates that you've been getting, August last year was the peak of when you should have fixed, and have gone as far out as you could get, because I'm pretty sure a lot of you may have got a one handle in terms of 1 point something % for 2, 3, 4, 5 years. That will probably be the best you're going to get for fixed, because the problem is in the States, for example, their 30-year mortgage bonds are in the 3s, and banks have to borrow at that. And that's why when you have a look at your fixed rates from your lenders here in Australia, they're well above variable. So the next question to you really is that possibly what you should be looking at right now, interest rates are going to rise. That's great. But again, you've still got emergency level mortgages for probably another week and a half for some. So I think I've seen CBA's the 20th of May. I think NAB's the 13th. I think Westpac's the 17th, whatever it bloody well is, doesn't matter. This is the time to go and say, I want a better rate. And if that means you threaten to leave your lender, do it. Because what you're then doing is you're going in at the current levels of discounted mortgage rates, which are still in the very low 2s. And then as rates rise, you'll just catch up to where you were. So that's the way to look at it in terms of the answer, Bryce, is that it's just, again, it's that money management of today, tomorrow, and beyond. Getting your rate down today so that tomorrow, when it does come up, it's actually at a level you've already been happy to accept, because people forget that banks are not your friend. Banks are just giving you a tool to do what you need to do. And unless you tell them to change your interest rate, they're not going to do it. So again, if somebody bought in 2020, like I did, for example, with the place that I'm currently living in, you were probably getting a discounted interest rate of about 2.5 to even as high as 3. That hasn't changed. That hasn't changed for you. The people that bought last year or have bought this year, they're lower than you. And they're the ones that everybody's been told to freak out about. Well, no, because their rate is already, as Ben's alluded to very, very well, getting money that is significantly cheaper than they would have otherwise got. Why can't you do that? And so to answer that question, variable at the moment is probably the cheapest and will give you the cheapest. And again, if you're on top of your own personal administration, there is no reason you can't keep chasing this year after year after year. Banks are not your friend, full stop. Always try and find a better rate. That's the simplest answer from a personal finance perspective.
No, very nice, very nice. Hey, so we were talking about, my final question is around crystal ball stuff. So we do know that that the markets, and you and I had a bit of a chuckle about this last week when we were chatting, around the markets are pricing in, 2.76 or something like that for the end of this year.
Yep.
You and I both don't believe that is anywhere near reality.
Correct.
I was interested to see that the technical forecast from the governor, he wasn't going to be drawn in on the questions he got, but what he did say, which is a combination of market forecasts and the economist forecast, and it's a blend of the two, that he was saying that the technical forecast is between 1.5 to 1.75% cash rate by the end of this year, and then by the end of 2023, a 2.5% cash rate by then. Do you think he's around the right ballpark compared to the market getting it wrong this time? Considering we've got to acknowledge that the market got it right before the governor and the board moved in terms of forecasting a rate change. But I just feel like there's a self-vested interest in the markets talking up higher rates for their bond purchasing. But anyway.
Correct. They got it right in moving. They didn't get it right in size. So that needs to be probably also clarified.
And that's been very common for the people who study this stuff. They always overshoot in terms of, the amount of rate increases. And that concerns people, right? Because hence why they think they need to fix. So it's a good segue into that. So you think they're about right?
Look, I was waiting for the assessment. I was a little bit more dovish on that. And what I mean by that is a little bit more conservative. I actually think that people will already change their behavior without actually things happening. And again, as we've just talked about for the last hour, the rolling off of inflation, all these other indicators that they require to make the decisions can actually work in the favor of not necessarily jacking up rates at the speed that the market is currently pricing. But I did reassess from yesterday in the fact that they believe that in core inflation will be 4.75% by December. That's going to require a bit of work to drag that down. So that would therefore mean that I think that 1.25% by Christmas is probably about fair. And although that might sound a little bit monstrous to some people, as we've just explained, it's basically where we were just before the pandemic started in fact, we're a little bit lower.
So we get one more next month or two? So what's the sequence?
And the argument is this: there's six more meetings to go, because it's the first Tuesday of every month to the end of the year. So there's 6 to go. If you look at it from that perspective, Bryce used this at the start when he read out the whole discussion. Normalization, they're still outside of normalization because they're sitting at 0.35 of 1%. Normal is normally in quarters of percents. So do they normalize next month, jack it up to 0.5 of 1%, and then go 0.25 of 1%, probably in August, September, and then November? That would get you there in terms of that space. It also means they have 3 reads of inflation, 3 reads of GDP, and 2 reads of the wage price index. Now, what I will say to the wage price index, and this is the debate that everybody's having at the moment in my world of economics, is the wage price index worthless because they've used the business liaison metric to move? And I agree with you. I think they've now told you the wage price index means nothing to them. They're using surveys of actual firms going, what are you charging for your rates? Okay, they're up X percent.
I've been watching that for the last 6 months going, my God, it's got to pop. Everyone that I'm talking to in the business sector is saying, are you paying more? Yeah. Am I paying more? Are you budgeting in more? Yep. So I'm glad that they've looked at it, because somebody's
got to ask the question, how is the modeling being done by the ABS? So that is the great discussion, because the ABS does things through modeling. They have a survey of a certain amount of households or what have you, and then extrapolate. And that therefore is open to issues around sampling sizes. And that's another discussion.
Yeah. And they talked about the government wage freezes that were going on as well, which is also hamstringing it. So I think that there's got to be a better mechanism in terms of what they're looking at, because existing employees who are staying are getting pay rises. as well as obviously people who are moving around. So I think there's
a miss.
Hopefully they can get their hands on some better data.
Yeah, there's a miss in the data.
Hey, Evan, my last question for you is, dare we go here, is 2007 was the last time that interest rate rise during an election campaign. Are you able to answer this agnostically about how that has an impact on both sides of politics, given that the RBA needed to show their independence and do something during this campaign, which is reasonably unprecedented. But interestingly, neither party contacted the governor, and he was happy to disclose that, which is good for both sides. But
absolutely
on politics.
Yeah, so the board, it depends on who you listen to. Some people will deliberately say that it is political, some people won't. Don't forget, the board is made up of 9 people. 4 of them are part of the actual RBA, but 5 of them are actually people of the community, and big people of the community, union leaders, business leaders, leaders of all forms of walks of life. So they therefore cover, inverted commas, the political spectrum. So the input therefore is zero in terms of my argument that they are completely independent, and they are there to do those 3 things we've discussed this entire hour, is around maintaining those 3 things. So they are independent. So in terms of the election, in terms of my view on that space, it will matter. And the reason for it is what we've been talking about right now is the cost of living, right? So the cost of living is certainly expensive, and the most average voter is feeling that. That's a given. So politically, it probably will play out as you would expect. And again, I don't actually think it will matter. And why I say that is that the polls have basically been unchanged for months. We've got 2 unpopular leaders. That's fine. We've got a feeling that we've got a government been in power for a decade or near enough to. There is a genuine feeling of change at the moment with regards to how you look at it. And for that reason, I don't think it's about the cost of living or about the interest rate change. It's because I think the electorate's just tired and wants a change. And that's more the answer in terms of what it is. From what we do, whether it's me investing in markets or you guys investing in property, neither side of politics is saying or doing anything that would suggest that they're going to be positive or negative or actually going to influence or touch what we do overly dramatically. The catch with that is that all of a sudden you could find a change and that happens retrospectively, which I know is a problem.
Yeah. What aren't they telling us? Yeah.
But on face value, for what we do, thankfully, from my perspective, there isn't going to be a major headache yet.
I think you're right there in the sense that gone are the days where you thought if you delivered, I mean, if you said to yourself, could you win government again if you delivered unemployment, with a 3 in front of it and an economy growing at 4%, you'd be pretty confident that you would get some votes, right? You'd be sort of, and you'd be returned to government. That's not what we're seeing out there at the moment. We're definitely seeing people. So the timing has been awkward. There's been no clear area around that. And obviously Labor's been able to prosecute a case of,
on that, don't forget 2007, same argument. Right. So 2007, the GFC hadn't started, right? So if you look at the last year of the Howard government era, things were really, really, really strong in terms of what they were sitting at. Whether you put that down to the government or not, doesn't matter. So it's interesting because, you and I, and, the 3 of us can debate this to the cows come home because it's obviously what we nerd out on. But in the end, it's not, politics isn't about that. We know that. There is no doubt that this is more about personality, tiredness, and just a feeling that we need to think about things that are different and want something different. And I think that's
there's definitely. Look, I mean, I'm fortunate that they're both in the centre. We're not, last 2 we've been debating about negative gearing changes and all these things where the unintended consequences were going to be significant. So whilst they stay in centralist politics land, it's a flip of the coin. It's what they show up when they get in.
And as we've discussed before on other discussions, Ben, is the issue is when they starting to talk around, and I know it's really a big passion of yours, things like rent freeze, or when they start introducing a level of regulation that actually makes it, unprofitable to be doing investment. And therefore, you destruct markets like you'd have no tomorrow. There is nothing worse than government intervention in markets. And I know that's a really, really straight out sort of Friedman point of view, but that's fine from the point of view that if you look at regulation that comes into markets that is supposed to help, never does, for a good reason, because people, again, behavior is my thing. And you understand that a taxation is a behavior changer. A regulation is a behavior changer. What is the behavior change going to be? Is it going to be positive or negative for the overall population? And most of the time, it'll probably be a negative one, because people do what needs to be done for them rather than anything else.
Because they bring it in for the lowest common denominator, for the 5% or the 10% who can't do that. So that's where safety nets and all of that come in, and social policy comes in. But I agree with you in terms of how you get robust, better standard of livings and quality of life, and you reward aspiration and hard work, and you have a reasonable safety net. You've got a damn good country, and you've got a damn good place to live. And at the moment, we really can't complain too much about where we sit. We had the government that were able to keep us all employed during a pandemic. So let's hope that whoever does win, continues on the status quo and starts to do a few more things on climate change and a few other little tidy ups. But other than that, as long as they allow us to, be what we want to be with as much opportunity as possible and reward those who put in the great effort. So I'm going to be a happy camper.
Evan, it's been a wonderful time chatting with you. I think on behalf of everyone in our audience, we want to thank your grandfather for all of the insights that he gave you back from the 50s.
Yes, that exactly
meant that we've just been entertained with some really complex topics that you've really broken down in a way that people can really understand. So we want to, on behalf of everyone at the Property Couch, Ben, I want to thank you for swinging past, taking a seat on the couch and sharing your wisdom and your insights.
No, more thank you for having me, guys. It's an absolute pleasure to sit here. I've always been a massive fan of what you do, and it's a real honor to be actually asked to sit here. So thank you for having me on.
Oh, no, thank you, mate.
Ben, talk about passion. Evan, I thoroughly enjoyed that. And I always love it when someone can distill big picture stuff, which he could easily blow us out of, well, not you, but a lot of people out of the water with with what he knows and the way that he explained it. But he distilled it down so that we can all make sure that people get what the impact of interest rate rises means, what that looks like for us currently, but also a little look around the corner to see what's on the horizon. But there was a fair bit that we covered in that conversation.
Well, obviously I was in my element in terms of it's iron sharpens iron.
You were up and about. Like, we had a little chat earlier today, and you were pumped.
Well, it because when you're interested in the subject matter and you're getting into this is interesting stuff, right? I mean, it has flow-on effects in terms of the future direction of the economy and what's going to happen. So yeah, it's just nice to be able to use sounding boards like Evan, where we can talk to each other. And obviously I've been interviewed a couple of times by his camp. And so it's great. It's great to be able to, sort of have that dialogue with each other. So I appreciate Evan coming on
interesting
and sharing
point.
his story.
Sorry, mate, to cut you across there, but interesting point that he said at the beginning around gaining time. I love that. And I was, as you saw when we had the chat, I was keen to lean on that. So if I merge a couple of things that he said and a couple of things that you said, we're moving from this active income through exertion through to passive. And then you obviously want to get your passive income greater than your active income. But then once you get your passive income greater than your expenses, then you move into the true definition of financial freedom, because you then have the ability to manage your lifestyle by design. And then if you get into that space, you actually do buy your time back, which was the very bit that he was talking about at the beginning. So there was a couple of merging of concepts there, but just to remind our audience of the power of that. But clearly interest rates is an anxiety point. I think the takeaways from today's conversation is it's actually a positive thing. We were at emergency rates. We're moving it to a normalized level. The economy is strong. We've actually had a period of time where, if you were prudent, and as we advise a lot of our clients, you're building up the buffers and you're making sure that you have settings that reflect long-term averages, not in the moment, Ben, of these lower interest rates. So we've been preparing our clients for 15 years, Ben, for as long as we've been in business, where we've been saying, hey, look, don't bring your interest rates down to where they are, bring it to a more conservative level. So we've been planning for some of these buffers. But it's just a reminder that around the country, the average dwelling is 595,000, but in Northern Territory, it's 405. Queensland, 524. New South Wales, obviously the highest at 760,000. ACT 635, Victoria 624, South Australia 437, WA 468, and Tasmania 442. So the average mortgage movement for a lot of people, will have a clearly a material impact for some people, but prepare yourself over time that there's going to be a number of rate rises over the rest of this year, to a point where we've been in a green paddock for a little bit. It's now moving to a point where hopefully you've positioned yourself for this to be not a huge impact on you, Ben.
Yeah, and obviously those medians that you're talking about there are including regional areas, because some people might be going, New South Wales, 760 median. They think it's over 1 million. Yeah, that's obviously Sydney versus Melbourne. So yeah, thank you for that. And another cool little rule of thumb, which is also in the economic update that I mentioned, is for every 0.1 of 1% rise, you're talking $100 in additional interest for every $100,000. So that's a good little rule of thumb in terms of how you want to look at this. So that way you can sort of work that out, and then you can go from there in terms of what the additional increase in your repayments are going to be. And that's over the year. Divide that by 12 and you get your monthly rate. So that gives you some idea.
Yeah. So again, thank you, Evan. Wonderful insights. Hey, my life hack today, Ben, is I've disclosed that I'm a Google Chrome user, Ben, as you. Are there any pages that you regularly open on a daily basis on Google, Ben, when you go in?
Oh, I've got heaps of them. But, like obviously, some of the news feed cycles, the economic pages, those types of things. Yeah.
Well, for a lot of people, when they log on and they open Chrome, there's usually 1, 2, 4, 10, however many pages that you regularly open, Ben. You can go and actually get that to fire up those pages every time you fire up Google. So as you go on the Google screen, the little 3 little dots on the far right, Ben?
Yes.
Scroll down to settings. When you get into settings, there'll be a menu on the left, and one of the options says on startup. And so you click on startup.
Yeah, got it.
And then there's an option to choose pages. So there's 2 pages within the business that I have to look at every single day. So I've just gone in there, I've programmed those 2 pages so that when I launch,
nice little hack,
Google Chrome, they just automatically open up for me, Ben. So
beautiful.
They're beautiful. In the background. I love it. So I am going to shout out to anyone who is a Google Chrome user. Go and check it out, fire it up, make sure those pages come up regularly. Ben, don't put the Collingwood Football Club in yours, mate. Don't waste your time on that.
It's already there. It's number 1, Bryce.
They're going nowhere, mate. So you don't need to do that. I'll save you the time. But mate, what's making property news?
Look, I thought I'd do a public service announcement, Bryce. I thought it was time. I picked up this article a couple of weeks ago, but I think it's still important. And so I'm going to use that for this week. And that is scammers are ripping off property buyers, right? So it's really important, and it is. It's actually material numbers we're talking about here. The story itself from the ABC News talks about a couple who lost $25,000 deposit. So what you're seeing is conveyancers are getting hacked, and potentially small real estate agent sites who may not have great security around their system are getting hacked. And what those hackers do is they're watching what's going on in terms of sale transactions and so forth, and they're issuing the invoices for deposits or for funds for settlements and so forth for those buyers in terms of the disbursements. And those buyers are believing in that email is legitimate, and they're making those payments. And obviously that money is gone once those payments are made. So there's a hygiene check here for everyone. That is, if you are receiving an email, even if it's from the legitimate email address, because they can even hack the email addresses, is to just ring them up and to double check that they have sent that. These are material numbers, right? You're paying 10% or whatever. So what's the harm in one phone call to your conveyancer to saying, I just want to check that this is from you because I'm about to make that wire, that payment. And if it's not, and it goes somewhere, it's very hard to get that money back. So please, when you're doing very large transaction movements around property, this is a timely reminder that there's no harm in double checking that it was a legitimate bank account and that you can make that transfer feeling comfortable that your money's not going to be lost, Bryce.
Well said, Ben. Very good. Thanks for what's making property news. But there you go, action-packed show, Ben.
Huge
you hinted
show.
Earlier before that we're going to talk about what impact that has on property next week. We're looking forward to that. Thanks again to Evan for swinging by the property couch. It won't be the last time we have Evan on the property couch to share his insights. But mate, until next week.
Knowledge is empowering, Bryce, but only if you act on it.
There you go. Heard it here first, folks. See you next week.
Hey guys, Bryce here again. Just want to catch you before you go and let you know, if you're new to our community, there are a lot of episodes to catch up on, but it's really important that you start from the very beginning at episode number 1. Because episode 1 through to 20 share all of the foundational pillars and frameworks that you need to know to get the best out of listening to this podcast. So I'd recommend that you start there, and the little tip is to maybe start on 1.5 speed. Now, for those of you that are time poor and don't have time to go back from the beginning, don't worry, we've got you covered as well, because we've created a binge guide that goes through all of the details and makes it easy for you to read and get up to speed very, very quickly. So if you go to thepropertycouch.com.au/fast track, you will be able to download that binge guide and you will be up to speed in no time. And whilst you're there, I've got a few extra goodies for you, because we have our top 5 frameworks that you'll learn on this podcast, as well as the Make Money Simple Again ebook, which will help you with the foundations of basic money management, so you'll have everything you need to succeed in building your own lifestyle design and getting the best out of this podcast. Now, just a reminder that anything that we cover on this podcast is not considered financial advice. We certainly recommend that you get your unique circumstances looked at by your individual advisor, and everything we talk about is just general in nature. To thepropertycouch.com.au/fast track, and you can go and get all those goodies and catch up right away.